We're in my family's forest near Bokota, Washington now, in a stand of young alder. And again, I want to take you through the stand assessment process in this different stand type. And at the very end of this, talk about some management recommendations for this type of stand. So beginning again with species composition, as I look around, like I said, this stand is largely dominated by red alder. It's a very young stand. The stocking density is incredibly high. I'm standing in the middle of a plot that I put in earlier, and it's running about 840 trees per acre, incredibly high stocking density. Um, the alder here naturally regenerated on this site after logging about 20 years ago or so. And with natural regeneration, the trees come in over a period of a few years. So I know that the age of the trees all falls roughly within probably anywhere from 18 to 22 years old or so. I would consider this to be a very homogeneous stand in the fact that, again, there's largely, it's dominated by a single cohort of red alder. Um, there is a little more species diversity in here. There's some Douglas fir, there's bitter cherry, there's cascara, there's some big leaf maple, but probably 90% of the stocking is Douglas fir. When I take a look up at the canopy also is very homogeneous. It's largely stratified to a single layer, and that's the layer of the alder crowns. But looking at the individual crowns of the trees, I can tell also that the trees, given the competition that's going on, some of them are beginning to express dominance, some of them are very subordinate, and that's expressed in the live crown ratio of the trees. The live crown ratio being the percent of total tree height in live green crown. So on the more dominant trees, they still have over 35–40% live crown, which tells me that they're still growing about as good as possible given the competition. But looking at some of the more subordinate trees, they could have as little as 15 or less percent live crown. And what's interesting to observe with live crown, the larger the live crown, the larger the diameter. The crown is the growth engine of the tree. So as I look around this stand and look at the larger diameter trees, that are upwards of 5 inches, and follow them up, I'll notice that the crown is a lot bigger than the trees that are smaller diameter, and also those larger crowns occupy a larger space in the canopy. Back to that notion of crown placement. Looking at the timber quality in this stand, it's a young stand. It's been growing under competition now for 20 years. So timber quality, by and large, is pretty poor. But again, when I look at the most dominant trees, like this one here to my left, it's still fairly straight. And looking around in the stand here, I'm seeing quite a few trees that are larger diameter, that are fairly straight. Given that alder is not very shade tolerant, they've begun to self-limb, so you've got fairly clean boles to them. And so I suspect if I were to come in and thin out the suppressed trees and retain the bigger diameter trees, that probably can improve timber quality in here, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a look at forest health. First of all, given a stand that's in this high of competition, we're getting a lot of suppression mortality in here. So again, the more subordinate trees are beginning to die off, and they're just creating small diameter snags. I'm noticing on some of the alder, this one here, that there's some kind of blistering and a black stain. I'm not entirely sure what that is, but I'm going to make some notes of that, take some pictures, and look that up when I get back to my computer. The Douglas fir in here are definitely subordinate in the canopy and looking pretty suppressed. Very thin crowns, very small diameter. If I want to keep those, I'm definitely going to have to release them and do something about that. I'm not seeing any obvious signs of pest infestations. There are invasive species in here, primarily Himalayan blackberry. So let's see, let's take a look at the understory vegetation. Um, Given the porous hardwood canopy, again, there is both a high diversity of understory shrubs in here. I'm seeing, besides the blackberry anyway, sword fern, blackened fern, salmonberry, ocean spray, vine maple, cascara, elderberry, trailing blackberry, lots more. I won't go on with that. So there's both a high diversity and a high abundance. It's a very thick, dense understory in here. Looking at wildlife habitat, given that this is a very young stand and that this is a third generation stand, the two most important wildlife habitat structures, large diameter snags and large down logs, are entirely absent in this stand. So there really is no habitat for cavity dependent species. There is a lot of forage in here, both a lot of berry producing shrubs, a lot of browse for ungulates, but probably with the best habitat function for this kind of a dense stand is as cover for small birds and bedding for deer. And in fact, I am hearing a lot of songbirds, so they're probably coming in here. They might be getting some of the moss for their nests, using this just for shelter from raptors, predators, etc. Look at the aspect. This is very flat. There's probably a slight slope to the northwest. Soils, there's no exposed soils here that would tell me what's going on, but since I'm familiar with the property, I know that this is a loamy clay soil. The vegetation also tells me something about the soil. Given that this is dominant to alder, there's a lot of salmonberry in here. Those species are indicative of wet soils. So there's kind of an overall stand assessment again. I want to talk a little bit now about management in a stand like this. Like I said, the alder here are going to be roughly about 20 years old. Incredibly high stocking density, 840 trees per acre. Looking at a red alder stand density index, if I want to manage the stand to get the larger diameter trees up to, say, a 10 to 12 to 14 inch merchantable diameter, I'm going to want to thin this down to around 200 trees per acre, probably 180 to at most 260 trees per acre. So that means I have to take out at least a quarter of the, or 3/4 of the trees in here. What I will do is focus on the trees that are already getting thinned out naturally, the ones that are already suppressed, small diameter, small crowns, and favor the larger diameter trees with the larger crowns. Given that there is or are some Douglas fir in here that are suppressed in the canopy, I'm also going to thin around this Douglas fir to try to release those and see if I can get them to continue to grow. And that way manage for some of the inherent species diversity here. So the next thing I'm going to do is just get in here and do some thinning, and then we'll take a look at this stand after it's thinned out and show you what that looks like. So I just finished thinning this young 18 to 22-year-old red alder stand, and what I did was largely thinned from below. What that means is that I took out the majority of the suppressed trees that were suppressed or subordinate in the canopy, or below the dominant layer of the canopy. That's what we refer to as thinning from below. The stand, like I mentioned, was running about 840 trees per acre, and now I've taken it down to about 180 to 220 trees per acre, slightly variable density as you go through the stand. It just naturally kind of fell out into that stocking density after I took out all of the small diameter and suppressed trees, as well as the dominant and codominant trees that had some kind of defect in them, either too much sweep, broken top, things like that. So it's kind of interesting that after thinning it and just removing what looked like should be removed, it naturally fell within that 180 to 220 trees per acre. Again, that stocking density is important because when we look at a stand density index for red alder, and if we were aiming the stand towards a merchantable average diameter at breast height of somewhere between 12 and 14 inches, the maximum stocking density of a stand like that shouldn't be much more than about 260 trees per acre. So I think we've hit kind of a sweet spot there. Taking a look at the residual trees, again, they were all comprised of the dominant trees in the canopy. And when you look at the live crowns now on these trees that we've retained, all the live crowns are at least 40% of total tree height. So even though this stand was growing under high competition for a long time, a lot of the trees in here, at least enough of the trees, still retain sufficient live crown that now that the stand has been thinned and these trees have been released, the trees should continue to put on good diameter growth and additional height growth. It is a little bit controversial thinning an alder stand of this age, given the growth dynamics of alder. After about age 20, they don't put on much more height growth. Certainly after age 40, height growth is largely stopped. So that's why it's really important to thin red alder at a very young age, as early even as 10 years old. You have to work with what you have. This is just a stand that I inherited, 20-year-old stand. But in looking at some of the other older alder that are off to the side of the stand, I cut some of them because they're really defective and looked at the growth rings of the stumps and saw, even in those older trees, that they put on variable growth over time. And something happened in the stand. I think it was 20 years ago when the adjacent stand was clear cut. Those alder at that time were released, and even at about 20 years old, they suddenly put on considerably more diameter growth. So that gave me some confidence that even if the trees that I just thinned out here don't put on too much more height growth, they should still plump up and put on more diameter growth. Most of the trees here are around 45, 50 feet tall, so I'll be able to get at least one saw log or two saw logs out of this once they achieve a merchantable diameter. It's probably going to take them another 8 years, maybe 10 years to get up to that merchantable size. And in that amount of time, they should put on some more height growth. So I'm hoping to get 2 logs out of each of these trees. So a few other things about the stand. Now that the canopy is opened up, the other thing that we're likely going to see is a significant response in the understory vegetation. It's probably going to grow up a lot taller. Given that it's comprised of salmonberry and there's a lot of Himalayan blackberry in here, that's effectively what I've released also, but that's just what's here. Not much that I can really do from a wildlife habitat enhancement standpoint, given that there aren't any large diameter trees that I can convert to snags or down logs. But one thing that I can do after I've thinned a stand like this is take a lot of the poles that I cut and pile them up to make constructed habitat logs, or take a lot of the slash and pile that up and make a wildlife habitat pile. So those are two things you can do in young stands after you've pre-commercially thinned them to add some kind of habitat structure back into them. But we'll check back on this stand in another 5 years, measure diameters, measure heights, and see if we have achieved an effective release because of this thinning. We're in my family's homestead property near Oakville, Washington, in a stand of red alder that we've been managing since we bought the property over 20 years ago. This stand of alder naturally regenerated following clear-cut harvesting just before we bought the land, but we have pre-commercially thinned it twice over the past 20 plus years. And I want to take you through the same stand assessment process that I just talked about and apply that to this forest. So again, starting from the very beginning, looking at the species composition, in this case, this particular stand is obviously hardwood dominated or dominated by red alder. However, scattered through this stand are some similar age Douglas fir. There are some older hemlock, there's some older red cedar, but by and large, I would consider this to be a hardwood dominated stand. I would also consider it to be fairly homogeneous. It is an even age stand. All of these alder are about 23 years old. Again, it's 90% or so stocked with alder, which in a single cohort, which to me puts it into a little more of a homogeneous condition. Looking at the stocking density in here now, again, keeping in mind that this has been thinned twice, the stocking density is around 200 trees per acre. If we were to look at a stand density guide for red alder, looking at the average diameter in here, it's about 8 inches in diameter. This alder ideally should be thinned, or we should be managing it somewhere between 200 and 260 trees per acre. So we've thinned it to the lower end of that spectrum. The age, as I mentioned, is about 23 years old. Looking at the canopy of the forest, looking at the strata of the canopy, it's a very simplified canopy. Again, a single cohort of alder, so there's not much canopy complexity. Looking at the crown placement of each of the trees and the live crown ratio, given the fact that this stand has been pre-commercially thinned twice, the live crowns on most of the trees, in particular the dominant and co-dominant trees, still easily exceed 35–40%, which tells me that each of the trees here are in a very robust growing condition. I have thinned most, if not all, of the defect out of this stand, so the timber quality is very high. Looking at forest health factors in here, I'm not seeing any obvious signs of poor forest health. There's no signs of disease, no signs of pests. There are no invasive species in the understory. The dead trees in here, anything that is dead are trees that I left behind that had been killed off from canopy suppression. They are subordinate trees, so I've just left them for what marginal value they might provide to wildlife. Looking at the understory composition in here, given again that this is a hardwood canopy and therefore very porous, and that it's been thinned out, there is a pretty lush understory. Now, even though it's lush, it is dominated by largely 3 or 4 species. We have sword fern, there is red elderberry, stinging nettle, there's red huckleberry, I see some hazelnut back there, but that's about it. It's even though it's lush, it's a fairly simplified understory. Plenty of light coming down through the relatively open or just porous hardwood canopy, and that's what's supporting the dense understory layer in here. Wildlife habitat, there are a number of old stumps in here that are going to provide habitat at least for insects, which will bring in small mammals that feed on the insects, bring in birds. There really are no what I would consider to be functional snags in here, snags that are 12 inches in diameter or larger. That's just an artifact of this being a young stand. So I would say that the wildlife habitat component is pretty minimal. I mean, you've got some browse in here. There are some berry-producing and nut-producing shrubs that will provide forage for wildlife. But as far as structure for wildlife, there's no big down logs. That's very much simplified. The aspect, in the topography. First of all, it's a fairly flat area right where we're at. We have a southern aspect, which means that it will be a little bit drier here than if we were on the north side of the hill. Soils, again, I already know the soils are clay. Looking at the nettles and the fact that this is dominant to alder tells me that the soils here are a little wetter than they are higher up on our land. Timber quality, all the trees are nice and straight, good diameter, good growth on them. So this stand, I think, is in a perfect position to just be let grow until we get the diameters up to a harvestable size, which I'm aiming for somewhere around 14 to 16 inches diameter at breast height. And given the growth rates on these trees, that'll probably take another 5 to 8 years, not long.